This is Judaism Unbound, episode 496, Smashing the Tablets. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we're excited to be diving into a book. It's called Smashing the Tablets, Radical Retellings of the Hebrew Bible, and it's edited by today's guests, Sara Lippmann and Seth Rogoff. It's a spectacular collection of provocative new readings of biblical texts by major contemporary Jewish writers. Since we started this podcast, we've been very interested in rewriting Jewish texts in ways that speak to contemporary sensibilities. Smashing the Tablets is a great model of just that. Reading it might inspire you to create your own radical retellings of the Bible and offer them to the world. But before we get into this book, Lex, are there any Judaism unbouncements this week?
Well, what a delightful little turn of phrase, Judaism unbouncements. Definitely we're not both way too proud of that and going to overuse it to death in the future. Certainly not. But yes, there are some Judaism unbouncements, Judaism Unbound announcements. We have mini courses in the Yeshiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning, that are beginning in just a few weeks. You can head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more. Just to give you a little bit of a taste, I will say their topics aloud. We have anti-fascist Musar with Reuven McCullough. There's also Comics Midrash, Drawing the Orchards or Pardes of Elul with Rina Yehuda Newman, our very own director of the Yeshiva Certificate Program in Unbound Judaism. We have Robin Banerjee teaching the Sidur Unbound, making the prayer book your own, and Wendy Bernstein-Lash teaching a course just about the month of Elul called Elul, Your On-Ramp to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Again, you can head to judaismunbound.com/classes to sign up for any of these. There is, as always, financial aid available. Big button on that page where you can submit your form and receive the financial aid that you need. We also want to shout out that, relatedly, Elul Unbound is coming up. The month of Elul begins just about a week, a little more than a week after this episode drops, and we hope that you will hop aboard our annual initiative called Elul Unbound. You can sign up for it by heading to judaismunbound.com/ELUL. Get our bi-weekly emails with all sorts of juicy goodies to enrich your Elul experience. You can also register for our Shabbat gatherings. We have weekly Shabbat gatherings throughout the month of Elul. We'll have 3 of them this time around, so we hope that you can register for those. You can find the link to that at that judaismunbound.com/Elul page and peruse around. Learn more about this amazing annual observance. Check out some of our past mini podcasts, making meaning out of the month of Elul, all sorts of good stuff. Just head to our website. So with that, Dan, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Lex. So our guests today, Sara Lippmann and Seth Rogoff, are the co-editors of Smashing the Tablets, Radical Retellings of the Hebrew Bible. Our first guest, Sara Lippmann's fiction, has won the Lilith Fiction Prize and has been awarded a fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts. She's the author of the novel Lech and the story collections Doll Palace and Jerks. Her essays have appeared in The Millions, The Washington Post, Catapult, and elsewhere, and she has been teaching creative writing for over 20 years to students of all ages, most recently with the Writing Collab, an artist-run online teaching cooperative of which she is a co-founder. Her new novel, Hidden River, will be published in 2026. Sara Lippmann has a BA from Brown University and an MFA from the New School. Our second guest, Seth Rogoff, is a novelist and scholar of media studies, literature, and cultural analysis. He's the author of books including First the Raven, a preface, Thin Rising Vapors, The Politics of the Dreamscape, and a collaboration with a former NBA basketball player entitled The Education of Kendrick Perkins. Seth Rogoff's shorter work has appeared in many journals, including Body, Epiphany, Eclectica, and Rain Taxi, and he's translated works by Franz Kafka, including the novel The Castle. Seth Rogoff has received grants from Duke University, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Maine Arts Commission, the Maine Humanities Council, and the University of Amsterdam, and he was a Fulbright Scholar in creative writing in Berlin, Germany. He holds a BA from Washington University in St. Louis, an MA from Duke, and a PhD from the University of Amsterdam's Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. So let's get cracking on some radical readings of the Bible. Sara Lippmann, Seth Rogoff, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So I thought an interesting way to start is, what did the communication look like when you invited people to submit an entry into this book? Like, what did you tell them that they were to do?
So the concept was just to take a biblical piece, any piece of their choice, and to retell it any way that they chose to retell it. I really wanted to keep it open. Really, it came out of my own writing practice. I'm a novelist, and I had been working for a long time doing that. Iterative stories, one after another, and kind of getting deeper into the particular moments and stories with every fictional retelling, discovering different details. And so I just started to see the kind of potential of that as a practice. And I was then interested to see how other people would approach it. And of course, other people have done that in the past. But in terms of this particular contemporary moment, I just wanted to see how it would come out if I got a kind of spectrum of responses all at once, right? And as a sort of stamp on how today's fiction writers would approach that kind of assignment. And then eventually, when I restarted together with Sara as co-editors, it widened a little bit to also include some personal essay, some nonfiction. But I think the basic principle, which Sara was originally going to be a contributor to the first iteration of this project, but I was like thrilled when she decided she would co-edit it with me and really be a like full 50-50 partner on the project. And then it just sort of like gained a lot of momentum.
I just want to piggyback up on what Seth was saying in terms of when I was first approached by Seth initially as a contributor, because I think this gets into something that you both have spoken about on a previous podcast about your certificate program and permission. But my initial reaction when Seth approached me just to be a contributor, heck yes, I will smash the hell out of any story here. And I felt excited by that. And that was generally the response from most of our writers when we approached them, that they were excited and game and really up to the task of smashing, queering, inverting, reclaiming text. I did have some exchanges with some writers. A few writers who were more hesitant came up against this question of sort of permission, of who me, which to be completely candid, I had the same experience when Seth kind of flipped the switch and approached me to take on the editorial role. Who am I to be an editor of a retelling of Torah? I am hardly a biblical scholar. I am a Hebrew school delinquent. And I came up against exactly this idea of needing some sort of permission or whatever that meant. And
by the way, I think Moses had a very similar hesitation, so
right?
You're in good company.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was sort of that vulnerability, that humility there. And so, but I realized that in essence, that's exactly what Seth was getting at. That was at the core of his entire project, was to grant this great invitation and permission to all of us.
So let's talk about smashing tablets, or maybe not talk about. Let's do it and talk about it simultaneously together. I'm a big titles guy. The most common question I've asked in the history of this show is like, talk to me about the name of your thing. But smashing the tablets, radical retellings of the Hebrew Bible. There's a lot there. So one thing I find interesting is smashing tablets isn't only a retelling. That's actually in the first version of the Bible, right? Like Moses does that. Moses like breaks the tablets almost immediately upon receiving them at that moment of revelation. That plays heavily in your book's introduction. And yet, still, the notion of smashing tablets, even if it is in the original Bible, I think sort of dovetails with what you described, Sara, as smashing texts, like inverting texts, thinking about them from new angles, placing the protagonists as antagonists and the antagonists as protagonists, and, setting them in a different time period or in a different place. I mean, your book has many different stories doing many different, strategies is one way to describe it, but another would just be different forms of storytelling. I would love to hear about that title, Smashing the Tablets. It is, on the one hand, kind of provocative, and on the other, I think it's intuitive. Like, we're part of a tradition that does actually look and relook and reframe texts. The Bible itself does that. What should we take from this title of Smashing the Tablets and of radical retellings of the Bible?
I guess the sort of central revelation that came to me, which maybe has come to many other people, and I'm sure you too have thought about it a lot. When I kind of encountered the biblical text early on in my life as a kid and then throughout my sort of adolescence, youth. You kind of brush through that moment because the story, that's one of the most dramatic moments in the entire Exodus epic. And you want to kind of find out what happens. But I never thought about what happened to those documents, what happened to the rubble of the tablets, right? That was one thing. And then the other thing is that it's just an incredible detail and a very significant detail, in my opinion, that the one text written physically by God is destroyed. And so there's this sort of void created at the center of the sort of textual universe of Judaism, or what became Judaism, which is such an onion of text upon text, retelling upon retelling. But then at the very center, there is this rubble, this void. And I feel like that symbolically for me, or allegorically for me, was a very provocative thought. And that's sort of why I thought this title was fitting, because that void is space. It's a kind of a densely empty space and pulls in, or sort of invites participation, because there's that space to be filled. But that kind of thinking made me kind of gravitate to and sort of be attached to this title.
And Sara, what about that amazing subtitle? What about radical retellings of the Bible?
Great question. Smashing, first of all, I just want to add, because for me, less of a biblical place, but just from a punk rock disgruntled youth place, smashing and all its sort of implicit violence and protest and resistance was something that I really attached to. And I think is very much in line with the ethos of what we're doing here, is sort of, again, yes, I understand that smashing the tablets is in the text, but from someone who was brought up in sort of this strange mix of orthodoxy and secularism, and grappled a lot with both indoctrination and sort of text as law, as because it is written. I just liked the sort of, forgive me, but the sort of fuck you gesture to smashing of text in its effort to sort of reclaim, because just historically, for me at least, as a young person and as an adult and so forth, when I would come up against those feelings, often the initial impulse is just to reject and turn away. And so rather than having that be the impulse, here it's let's break it down and make something else. And then as for radical, despite the fact that I just was talking about violence and, punk and that sort of physicality of it, he really meant radical as sort of, radical empathy, radical reaching out, radical generosity, radical opening, and not as a violent measure by any means.
I'm curious a little bit about this project of rewriting, reinterpreting, retelling the Bible, and whether you saw a commonality in how some of the authors were approaching it, or it was really kind of across the board. I'm using as a jumping off point two things. One is Shalom Auslander's introduction, and the second is something that you said earlier, where you talked about the smashing of the tablets, right, as the one thing that God actually personally wrote, and it was destroyed. And on the one hand, that's something that happens in the story. It's a part of the story. On the other hand, as you were saying it, I was like, oh, what a beautiful metaphor. What an incredible metaphor for how ultimately, right, nothing is set in stone. I mean, maybe that's an even more simplistic way to say it. But I find that when people look at the Bible, they often don't look at it as metaphor. They often look at it as either a story that is meant to in some way capture history, or a story that was meant to capture history, but they don't believe that, and they think it's terrible and want to really kind of smash it. And in some ways, Shalom Auslander's introduction is a version of that. Hopefully not to spoil it too much, but there's a great part where he says something along the lines of, imagine if the movie Jaws was presented through the view of the shark, and the shark was supposed to be the good guy. Nobody would buy that.
I'd buy it immediately. Give me that film. I'm ready to roll.
Right.
Dan, it's gonna break box office records. I can't disagree more, but I hear what you're coming from.
I think that's true for now, but
we just saw Wicked take all sorts of box office leads, so that's the bad one being
sure,
good.
and I'm into The Last of Us these days, so there's a lot of, but when I think about what he's describing, I feel like what he's saying, and he's saying it very explicitly, is it's not what the story actually says, it's how we have been told to read it that's the problem. And so you can imagine that one approach is to say, I don't need to retell this story. I just need to give you a different lens through which to read it. So maybe it's more like imagine a book of new introductions to biblical stories or something like that that would just give you a new way into the story as it exists. But the other possibility, I think, is to read a lot of this as a metaphor. So, for example, if you read God as a metaphor for just the terrible things that happen, the capriciousness of life, well, that's the world that we live in. That's if you ascribe intentionality to it, then that would seem to be a mean-spirited God or a wicked God. But if you just say, but that's a metaphor for the fact that bad things happen to us all the time, then that's actually just true. If you smash it, in a sense, you're potentially not learning what it's trying to tell you, which is just about the capriciousness of life. And so I'm just sort of wondering, as writers yourselves and as people who think about writing and what writing is trying to do, both about your way of looking at the Bible and potentially, Seth, through the story that you wrote, and Sara, the story that you might have written, and then also what you saw the other authors doing.
I think you're right that it can be easily read as, it can be read in numerous ways. And I think that's what's so exciting about the text. In terms of the idea that it's a metaphor for just how things happen, I think that's true. On the other hand, which I think what Auslander is getting at, is there's a kind of moral or causal framework that it's not just bad things happen, it's bad things happen for a certain reason. And here's an explanatory framework, and here's how you mitigate that or avoid that or deal with that. So I think it's more layered than simply a metaphor for the capriciousness of fate or something like that. How I started getting into it, it took a while for me to sort of move beyond tinkering around with the stories to really feeling free and having the permission or just having the confidence maybe to just steer the stories where I felt like I wanted them to go, to add to them, to contradict them. And ultimately, I think this is maybe part of what's not in that preface to the book, is that, yes, there is a lot of tyrannical and awful elements to the biblical text. I don't think anyone can really deny that. I guess it depends on what lens one uses to view it. But from my perspective, that's the case. It's not a entirely consistent text, as most people know who've spent time with it. And so you can find, for example, clear elements of authoritarianism in the text. You can also find, I think, very strong anti-authoritarian impulses, sometimes within the same page or couple of pages. And I think that's the opportunity that we have, is to really seek out elements of the text that not only support, but that deepen our kind of moral and ethical commitments.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the examples of stories in your book, of retellings. Seth, I did in fact notice that the story you wrote, which is about Cain and Abel, was written by somebody whose name is Seth, and who is therefore the third brother in that generation of the Adam and Eve story. I did notice that. And so I kind of am curious to both of you. You both have Genesis grounded names, Bereshit grounded names. I am kind of curious about your relationship to the characters of your own namesake. But Seth, since you did have a story in this collection, I'd love to talk about Cain and Abel. There are many people who have looked at the Cain and Abel story and sought to find a more sort of sympathetic read on Cain, or at least, I don't know if sympathetic's the right word, at least like to get Cain's voice in the story, in the same way of like, what would the shark say in Jaws? It's like, what would Cain say? Because Cain does not really have his voice given. We don't know what his framing is. And for those who don't know the story that well, I mean, to distill it super concisely, overly concisely in the original text, Cain and Abel are two sons of Adam and Eve, the first human-generated children that we hear about in the Bible, and they each offer a sacrifice to God. God likes Abel's, and God does not like Cain's. Cain finds that out. Cain kills Abel. We get very fragmented story. We don't hear a whole lot in between the lines about people's motivations. The Torah doesn't do that very much. We actually have an incomplete sentence where it says, "and Cain said," at one point. It doesn't tell you what Cain said. But I'm kind of curious, Seth, to hear from you, just as a window into one of these stories. Talk to us about Cain and Abel and sort of what this story seeks to do. You can give whatever amount of spoilers you'd like or not like, but I'd love to ground this conversation in one of the particular stories in your book.
So I've been thinking about Cain and Abel for a long time. It was a sort of central motif of a novel that I wrote a few years ago called Thin Rising Vapors, which was about kind of what is our responsibility to the other, which is one of the central questions that comes up in the story. Are you your brother's keeper? This story is a fragment of another novel that was recently published called The Castle, in which I have 5 or 6 different retellings of the Cain and Abel story. In all of them, though, I'm positing Cain as innocent and as sort of engaged in a kind of conflict or antagonistic relationship with God. And that God is kind of using this fraternal conflict or sort of stoking a fraternal conflict in order to deal with the unity of humanity. God doing the murder in order to divide humanity rather than humanity sort of inherently, intrinsically at odds with itself. So I wanted to question the premise that there's something inherent and intrinsic about human to human violence and how that is like presented right at the beginning of the sort of human story, like in the first chapter, basically, after the creation story. And I thought that reflects more an attempt to solidify an authoritarian position for God rather than anything real or inherent. And so I wanted to try to break that down. So that was the basic impulse for the story.
And Sara, I'd love to hear your voice just on one or two of the stories that really calls to you, not as author, but as editor and as reader.
Certain themes did emerge, and one of them was recentering female characters that had been marginalized or erased or barely imagined. And so there are so many examples, so many wonderful examples in the anthology. One, of course, perhaps the more obscure choice, but our writer Erica Dreyfuss retold the story of Jephthah's daughter, unnamed daughter, who remains unnamed even in her retelling. For me, or someone who doesn't have a real Talmudic background, like this was not a story that was on my radar as a young person. And so, but it's interesting because we all know about the near sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, but this is a story of sacrifice completion, so to speak. And it was not a story that I was familiar with.
It's in the Book of Judges for folks looking for it.
Thank you.
We'll throw it in the show notes.
It's in the Book of Judges. Anyway, horrifying, really grim story. And she retold that and recentered it through sort of a choral voice of women surrounding her. She went up to the hills for a number of days before succumbing to sacrifice at the hand of her father. That was an interesting story. And one other one that I want to highlight here was a really interesting take by a novelist named Ziva Bukai. But she took on the story of Lot. In the actual text, Lot's daughters seduce him. And she said, hell no, that's not how it went. And so she retold it in a modern day Brooklyn, I'd say like 1970s, 1980s Brooklyn, in which the Lot figure is quietly preying on his own daughters. Is considered to be a tzaddik, is considered to be a well-respected man in his community, and is quietly preying on his own daughters. And I thought that was a really powerful reclamation.
I'm curious, as editors, as you think about the process of having edited this text, does it make you think about the Bible in a different way in its own editing? I mean, do you see the hand of the editor of the Bible in a way that you might not have seen before?
Again, like having been brought up from more of a place, maybe this is unfair, but more of like a place of literalism, tons of midrash and interpretation and so forth, but more of like, I would say more of a conservadox framework where now, and this started obviously maybe in my teens and 20s, but certainly this book in the spirit of permission, as we've talked about before, has made me really sort of think about these entry points for us as readers. I don't know that I'm thinking so much about authorship, but in the same way that, who authors Greek mythology or other texts that we certainly retell and without any hesitation, editing this project and spending so much time revisiting stories and learning new stories and reading more deeply into them, it feels so much more elastic and nimble. And in the way that, we often in literary podcasts, there's often a question of what's your desert island book, right? Like, what's the book that you're going to take with you and revisit over and over again, and has that sort of elasticity and generative quality where it continues to be interactive and we continue to discover more each time we enter. And as someone I wouldn't knee-jerk respond to the Bible if you had asked me that question in the past, right? But through this experience, I really see that in the way that, perhaps I would have previously said, oh, Ulysses, which of course is a retelling in and of itself of the Odyssey, but it has that, like, there's so much elasticity there. There's so many opportunities for discovery and for, as Seth has spoken about, this sort of radical reading, which, if I were stranded on a desert island with only one text, I would want to have a book that invites that level of interaction.
So I, regularly teach text from the Bible, and very regularly I inhabit the vantage point of, okay, so what if X character who's originally framed as bad is the good guy? What if Y character who's originally framed as good is actually the villain? I had somebody say to me once, I think it's happened a few times actually, Lex, some of the bad guys in the Bible are actually not great, and some of the good characters are actually good. And my response was, sure, but the point of this isn't actually to determine, like, which characters are good and bad. It's like, how can we grow through reading the story through once and saying, yes, Moses is the good one. If you adopt the interpretation of everything Moses is doing is good here, what can we learn from that? I think that's actually an exercise worth doing. Now, I think it's a more worthwhile exercise if you supplement it with, what if everything Moses does here is terrible and wrong? Both of those lenses actually are worthwhile. I mean, people talk about this like hermeneutics, like a hermeneutics of suspicion and a hermeneutics of just generosity, like where you grant the text a positive valence versus granting the text not so much innocent until proven guilty. And I don't know, I think that there actually is value in looking at every good character and saying, what if they're not? And looking at every antagonist and saying, what if they're not? And again, to shout out Auslander's foreword, which I do think that foreword is very powerful. It basically says, like, God's the bad one. This book, it fully adopts a framework of let's look at every good character from the other side and every bad character from the other side. And I guess I'd kind of love to hear from you a call to action on that front. Should we do that? Am I off base when I say to the people who question my strategies in class, like, actually, we should see every single character from both of those frameworks, because only when we look from all sides of the sculpture in the museum do we get the full picture.
I mean, Auslander's forward is incredibly powerful, but he ultimately arrives at not only is God the bad, but humans are human, right? It's not just humans are good, but humans are human and vulnerable and fallible, and we're trying to make our way. The thing that I bristle at a little bit in sort of is just re-solidifying the binaries of good and evil generally. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I would argue, I agree with you that, having, a full panoramic view or, complete view of people is exactly what we need.
Maybe that's like the end goal of the strategy. I didn't articulate that.
Yeah. I guess I question a little bit, like, why are we still utilizing terms like good and evil? I mean, I know certainly in this moment right now, in our cultural moment, it often feels like we've entered the Marvel universe. People in power are evil. Like, it feels that way. So, like, I'm aware of those binaries and I'm aware of how they're solidifying. But I also feel like in terms of exercise, excuse me, this tangent, but like one of the problems that I'm seeing like in literature right now is this inability in literature and in humanity, right? Because they're connected, is like this inability to hold contradiction, this inability to see nuance and feel nuance. And so do we have to like re-implement these hardened, these sort of reductive terms?
I'm always skeptical if like somebody tells me that they are something over and over again, trying to convince me through this repetition. And I guess when I encounter the first part of the Bible, like the creation narrative, and everything is presented as good by the text. And so the question is, why is the text repeating this over and over again? So that already like makes me a bit skeptical and makes me want to question it. Defining the entire creation project as good versus a sort of more amorphous, less ordered, less structured, chaotic state of being, which is what the sort of creation story is rhetorically countering, is kind of an ideological position. And so for me, it's like less good or bad and more like what's the position, like what's the ideological position that the text is taking, and how can we kind of think about them and decide what we think is the best position for us to occupy. And this, I guess, goes to something that's really at the core of what I understand your mission to be, to cultivate deliberately through work, through engagement, through community or whatever, to cultivate a kind of sense of Jewishness that is, self-created and not imposed.
I was just struck by what you said earlier, Sara, when you were talking about Ulysses, and how it struck me that one of the book that's sort of cited as often the greatest book of literature in the English language is actually a midrash, or a retelling. And of course, like we know that, and yet we've kind of been taught to appreciate Ulysses as its own work of literature, as it should be. And yet the Bible is kind of held up by many as this ancient and perfect. And if you were going to rewrite the Bible, if James Joyce was going to try to rewrite the Bible, I don't know, people would just put it on a shelf of, some kind of other shelf, not great literature. I guess what I'm wondering is whether, having come through this project, you think of the Bible as a great piece of literature, or perhaps the greatest piece of literature. I was listening to a podcast that I love recently about people that are watching the show The Last of Us, and it started as a video game, and the person on the podcast is saying, this is the greatest story ever told, and the other person says, well, the greatest story ever told, I mean, what about the Bible? And this guy grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, I think, and he's not really too into the Bible, so he's like, that wasn't really an option for him. But I guess my question is the Bible really great literature, or is the Bible something that has been so core to the world of which we are part that it's good literature, right? It does respond to important questions about what life is about, or about the state of our lives, or our relationship with the universe or with the earth. And it's a great starting place, but actually, in some ways, some of these stories you could call them an improvement, or you could say, no, this is really, the Bible is actually not something that should be held up as a great work of literature. The whole power of the Bible is that it is a jumping off point for much more great literature that's clearly come out of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the many things that makes, in my opinion, Ulysses so great is that it is absolutely profane and unhinged in a way, honest, and it does not hold back. That's just an aside about those elements being so important to me and what I consider to be great literature. And so thinking about the Bible, I mean, if I were to apply notions of literature to the Bible, like the characters are flat often, there's all these gaps. We don't have great descriptions. We don't really have a wonderful sense of play, in terms of craft. There are whole sections in the middle that are incredibly boring. The very beginning is very dramatic. Like, I'll give it that. It's got a lot of drama right in front. But like, it has moments. But to me, what's interesting is, we say in literature, like, use this. We use what's inside of us, right? We use, where do stories come from? Where do ideas come from? They come from the world around us, and they come from what's inside of us. And so, for better or for worse, many of us have a relationship with this text, or it's inside of us in some way. inside of us as a form of protest, inside of us as a form of moral guidance or whatever, or as a form of something, to push against. Okay, for better or for worse, this is the book that so many of us have. Now, what are we going to do about it? And I think the way that it's constructed, the way that it's structured, it's really designed to offer that as a question. Now, here it is. What are you going to do about it? That it has this sense of incompleteness and lack of form that, Seth wrote about so beautifully in the introduction. That really is, okay, so now imprint yourself.
I really love that, Sarah. And you've brought me to a weird, but I think enjoyably weird analogy. I'm thinking of like at the amusement park or at various attractions where there are those art pieces, but they have the head holes so that you walk up and you put your head in there. And then it's like, oh, look, I'm Batman now, or I'm whatever the thing is. You stick yourself in there. You stick your head in the empty hole, and then somebody takes the photo and like, there you are in, I mean, you mentioned Marvel before. I guess I did DC Comics, but like you're in the Marvel universe or you're in whatever story is being featured that those head holes are cut in. Like, I think what you're suggesting, and I thoroughly agree, is that the Bible offers these head holes. It offers these gaps, whether it's purposeful or not. Like, I do sometimes think that people ascribe to the Bible like an intentional gap making. That I don't know if it maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Like, I don't know if it was purposefully leaving gaps for us to fill, but whatever the intent or non-intent, what we're left with is a text that kind of has head holes, and that allows us to put ourselves in there or put our own stories, our own angles on it in a productive way. What's beautiful about the thing at the amusement park is like, I go and I put my head in, but then I like take it out and then the next person goes. Like, it's not permanent. My insertion of myself does not preclude others from doing the same. And I think your book models that. I mean, there are some stories that get covered multiple times in your book. Neither one is asserting to the other like, oh, well, this is the real one, yours can't be. No, there is an inherent multiplicity of truths. And the Bible itself does that. Like, people try to write off contradictions and try to square the different versions of stories, but like there are different versions of the same story within the text of the Torah itself, which again, you could argue is feature or bug, whatever you want. But I guess I'm kind of curious. You talk about gap filling in your intro to this book, and I'd love to dwell there a little more. I mean, from a traditional perspective, there's the notion of like white fire, which there's the black fire is the letters of the ink in the scroll of the Torah, and the white fire is the background. It's the negative space. It's the page. It's what is left for us to generate meaning between the lines and in the margins around the lines. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that spiritual act of gap filling or that intellectual act of gap filling. And in the spirit of that, because your book, it's not comprehensive and it doesn't claim to be, I'm kind of curious if in your own book of all these different gap filling acts, whether there are gaps themselves. Like, I opened the book and I was like, oh, I wonder what the alt take on Korach is going to be and how Korach from the book of Numbers is the good guy. There wasn't that, but it kind of leaves the head hole for somebody like me to maybe play around with that. So talk to us more about gap filling.
I mean, I think for me, I don't think, as you said, that we have to ascribe any intentionality. I mean, first of all, the literary forms, as you two know quite well, better than I do, is that the literary forms are completely different to apply sort of modern expectations about literature, especially this kind of like bourgeois era of literature that rose in the late 18th, early 19th century, and have some kind of established themselves as the model for how to tell stories. I mean, those are incredibly new in human history, and for most of the time, like storytelling and text had completely different forms, and readers, a much smaller number of readers, had different expectations when confronting the text and behaved differently in front of the text. But so I think these gaps they're there. They're opportunities. They're invitations to experiment, chances to start conversations. They're provocations for us to think. And I think all texts really do that. This is, of course, like in a way, the principle behind the sort of deconstruction literary theory, that there isn't any kind of coherent, cohesive, fully intentional text, that there's a lot of unintentionality going on behind the scenes. But yeah, so I guess gap filling is like, I think, or gaps are the great strength of the text, in my opinion. And the invitation to creatively encounter those gaps is open to all of us. And I feel like it's really enriching as part of my creative process to grapple with that.
Yeah, Lex, you should do Korach.
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking that you should.
I've got so many. I love the Book of Numbers, so I've got.
I don't think we have a single story from Numbers, do we? I don't think we have anything from Numbers.
There you go. So I'll make the sequel.
Exactly. I mean, I think if anything, you use this word modeling a few times, and I think that that's really modeling and tied with this idea of just, yes, go and do instead of being checked out. I remember as a young person, being subjected to synagogue over and over again, right? And inevitably the mind wanders, right? And the imagination kicks in and all this stuff happens, right? When you're sitting there and you're, kids today, look at me, I'm so old, but like kids today, this idea of what happens when we're bored and we don't have our phones and we're sitting in space and what can be unlocked and imagined beyond, I think whether we're sitting in synagogue or anywhere, I don't mean that it needs to be limited to that space by any means, to the contrary, but this idea that all of us can rewrite the story, many stories, the same story again and again, right? And by no means do we pretend to think that this anthology is complete. If anything, it's just a starting off point, particularly for those who might have felt at some point, oh, this is not for me, but to say, hey, in fact, it very much is.
So deep listeners of this podcast will know that I just mentioned I love the Book of Numbers. That's a canonical book I love. And we definitely should have, to listeners out there, let's make the Korach retellings. Let's make the Atone, that's the donkey that Balaam rides at a certain point. Let's make all the Numbers retellings that we need to build a better world. The Zimri and Cosby retelling. I'm just throwing out some of my faves. But I want to name in this conversation that, like, Seth, you were talking about like the modern or bourgeois way of understanding literature. I think sometimes there's a danger when we look at retellings of Jewish text to think that like this is exclusively a very new thing to do. And I don't want to pretend that like postmodernism is not playing a role in this. Like, we live in a world that has created Wicked, and what if the Wicked Witch was actually the good character? What if the big bad wolf was the good character in a famous children's book? We have that, and that is part of the context that is shaping all of us. And I want to shout out the Book of Jubilees, which is a book from what people term the Apocrypha, that was written 2,200 years ago and basically says, hey, Genesis, cool story. That's like a great start, but I'm actually going to change a bunch of things about you. I'm going to add in a bunch of characters you didn't include. I'm going to change some details. I'm going to cut some stuff entirely. I'm going to add in a bunch of angels and demons you didn't mention. 2,200 years ago. Radical retelling of Genesis in certain senses. And what I love about Jubilees is that it doesn't take a submissive stance. The reason I struggle with Midrash, like people presume that I would be like a lover of Midrash and that I would like spend a lot of my Jewish time and textual time in Midrash. And I actually don't spend that much of it there. Because what I struggle with Midrash is that it tends to place itself as sort of a lower category than quote unquote the original. What I love about the Book of Jubilees, and it's okay, I don't know the extent to which either of you have spent time with Jubilee, like it's not that, but like what I love about it is it places itself on equal terms, and in some ways on higher terms than the original text. It is very ambitious. And I actually, as a should question, like I'm kind of curious what you would advocate for people to do with the Bible. And one of my shoulds is that we shouldn't place ourselves necessarily as underneath it. With your collection, these stories don't say like, we're a footnote, we're lesser than. Like they offer you the opportunity to read them as being just as much the story as quote unquote the original story. I'm kind of curious how you conceptualize that question. Like, how do we as shapers of Jewish stories do so in a way that allows ourselves to be not only like the commentator, the submissive one, but sort of the main creators?
I mean, I love that. And I completely agree. And that it's not, I think, a fully accurate term to Midrash to describe what's happening in the collection. And I do think that the authors are really owning this material and kind of positioning it in parallel to the stories that they're responding to, and that's what I'm really happy with. And I think generally that's exactly right. Like, it does take a certain boldness to feel like one has the right to kind of put oneself on an equal plane with the biblical text. It's like a very daunting enterprise. But I find that, like, at least in my own writing, if I'm not doing that, if I'm kind of feeling the subordinate position, then I just can't work with the material at all well. And the text that I'm trying to work on just collapses or fails in not a good way. There's a sort of this rhetoric of good failure, but that's not what I mean here. But that when approached with this mentality, I just think so many creative opportunities arise. For me, it is kind of a spiritual experience to work with the text in this way. I find myself most sort of creatively alive when I'm inside these texts, building, thinking, contradicting, utilizing, traveling down different pathways to different answers, sometimes even internally contradictory ones. With my latest project, I kind of brought together biblical texts, mostly through the Cain and Abel story, with a kind of intertextual experiment with Kafka's novel, The Castle. So I had both of these texts, which are probably my two favorite works to explore. And so I was really trying to keep all three of these pieces, all three of these balls in the air. And that was both daunting, but incredibly invigorating, I have to say.
I did an event for this project, and one of the interesting questions that came out in the audience was, how much rooting did these authors need or have before they really, the story took on a life of its own?
Sorry, I want to mark a pun. I know you meant how much background or depth of knowledge might they have, but you could also hear that as how much rooting, how much of a rooting interest might they have. And I think that's actually kind of what they don't necessarily need, a defensive posture towards the text.
Right. And so this whole idea of having it really grow and be its own thing. And so I just want to point to two stories in particular in the text, Rosebud Ben-Oni's story retelling of Eden and Michael Zapata's story retelling of Noah, that are so loose from whatever the original, so to speak, text was. And they, I think, are wonderful examples of possibility, and they just operate on a different playing field where they're not at all nodding. I mean, you don't get that sense of them being subordinate to the text really at all. There might be an Easter egg there if you're looking for it, but they really have very much their own embodiment. And so I think that's a little bit related to what you were saying about Apocrypha and subordination. And the other thing that I wanted to add on, your question makes me even question this own process. We were faced at one point with how to assemble all these stories. And so, and to what degree do we need to externally impose a nod from the original? And so Seth and I ultimately came up with this idea of these epigraphs to kick off each story, just so there was some kind of link. But to be clear, the writers themselves did not provide those. We externally imposed them. And so I don't know, was that the right impulse? Was that the wrong impulse to even have them there together? I don't know.
We don't always think about how books are read by people. I know that's kind of a funny thing to say, but books aren't just receptacles of text. They are interfaced with by people that read them and change through them or learn through them or become through them. I feel silly even saying this because it's just sort of a thing we all know. We read books and something happens to us, hopefully. And I guess my question as we close is, what are some, I'm not going to ask you what should happen to folks, because I know immediately you'd say, well, there's lots of different things that could happen and there's not one, but what are some possibilities for how somebody would mobilize this book? And I don't just mean practically you could read one story on its own, or you could read all of them at the same time. Once people read this and have it soak into their mind and heart and whatever is happening, how might it then be something they emanate outward with? Like, what are some then what's that you imagine readers generating, with the caveat that they will still surprise you and generate things that you couldn't even think of here?
This relates to something that you had said on a previous podcast, and I think it was you, Lex, but although it might have been you, Dan, about us being at this sort of critical juncture in Judaism. And there was an analogy, I think it was your interview maybe with Rabbi Spodek. What is the future of Judaism? What's it going to look like? And, as we move away from like synagogue life institution, I think that this anthology has the possibility to pose that larger question of sort of, how are we going to interact with text and reclaim it and build something new, future, relevant, just, how are we going to imagine greater possibilities beyond the scope of what we've been given? Sorry if this answer is a little bit tangential, but I just came off of a bar mitzvah of my cousins. They're these amazing activists in Boston, and it was at the Boston Workers Circle.
Oh, well, show note their bar mitzvah ceremony. We've mentioned it in the past. It's a cool thing.
Oh, you have? Okay. So I just was there this past weekend, and it was amazing because, first of all, my cousin is someone who would never have been bar mitzvahed, rotely repeating sort of this hardened tradition by any means. And so the fact that he participated in this ceremony and it really called upon all these amazing kids to think deeply about identity and what Judaism means to them, and to like push at it and pluck at it and extrapolate the values that are meaningful and to activate them. And they did all these amazing projects. And it was such an incredible, radical showcasing of identity and possibility. And I feel maybe it's sort of lofty for me to try to wedge our anthology into sort of the same realm, but I feel like it's offering that to the people, it's offering that up to say, like, not to be a passive, complacent person here, but to really imagine ourselves into these stories.
I'm also, as I think from my listening to your podcast, you are very concerned with the future of Judaism, what we're building, what sort of Jewish life is becoming, what it could become. For me, I'm feeling at the moment, in one strange way, like more Jewish than ever, but at the same time, less Jewish than I've ever felt, because I feel estranged from so much of the Jewish world and alienated. I had to leave. I live in Prague in the Czech Republic.
With Kafka.
Yes. So I had to, Kafka kind of embodies this exact position. So maybe I'm just like being cliche, but I had to leave the small Jewish community that I had been a member of for a while, where my daughter had her bat mitzvah, because it was not reflecting values that I shared. It was reflecting positions that I found pretty much abhorrent. So that felt like really awful to me, that this one community that I had sort of discovered and become a part of slowly after searching for one that fit my worldview, this relationship ended up collapsing, not in any like antagonistic way, but just a quiet way, but still feeling kind of alienated from that and generally from the broader Jewish community here. So I guess it's a strange time for Jewish life, Jewish thinking, Jewish creativity. And I just think, okay, we did this very small project, this anthology, we're putting it out there. If it's part of like a broader sensibility that I think is reflected in the mission of Judaism Unbound and all of the amazing teaching and learning and community building that's going on here, that would be great. If it amounts to nothing, well, okay, it was still our attempt to add something that we found interesting into the conversation.
Well, I don't think it's amounting to nothing. There's already quite a bit of something here and so much more to come. So thank you so much, Seth and Sara, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It's been so much fun.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Lex.
And thanks, of course, to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A couple reminders as we close. First, 3-week mini courses in the Anya Shiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning, begin very soon. Head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more. We have 4 amazing options for you to take to add meaning to the month of Elul, the final month of the Jewish year before we head into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Lots of good learning and unlearning to do, so don't forget, head to judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid is available for all 4 options. We also have Elul Unbound, which will be beginning in just over a week from when this episode initially drops. So head to judaismunbound.com/Elul, E-L-U-L, so you can sign up for our bi-weekly email list, which gets you all sorts of juicy goodies, videos, texts, resources, practices to make your month of Elul more meaningful and help you prepare for the high holidays. We also hope that you will register for our Shabbat gatherings that take place throughout Elul Unbound. Lots of good stuff for you to register for and engage with. Just head to judaismunbound.com/ELUL. As we close, we are always grateful for you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do so. First, there are our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other resources, and you can email Dan or I at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also, of course, deeply grateful when any of you out there are able to support us financially, which you can do by heading to judaismunbound.com/donate and making either a recurring monthly donation or a one-time gift. So thank you all so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.